Although House Speaker Mike Johnson seeks to bring the $95 billion Ukraine bill to a vote, there is currently a debate in the U.S. about whether we should provide more military help to Ukraine. Some believe that no matter what we do, the situation in Ukraine won't change and that it will remain deadlocked. But that is not the case, and history has shown that to not be the case. Many times we've seen smaller countries beat back larger countries. This debate is so heated that once again members of Congress, including Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie, are willing to plunge the GOP into chaos by vacating the speaker's seat. For no reason other than they have to be supporting Putin at this point, or Putin has something on him. There's just no other explanation. They are fighting Ukraine aid so much that I now question their funding sources at this point. The reality is our hesitance has consequences. The Institute for the Study of War writes that the Russian military is moving out of their fixed positions and becoming more mobile on the battlefield. This shift has happened because we in the US have been slow to deliver the military support Ukraine needs. Now Ukraine is at a critical point where they cannot maintain their current defensive lines without our help. And when I say our, I mean Europe's help too, because they've kind of shit the bed in providing aid recently as well. And this is help that includes things like air defenses and artillery, which the US can provide quickly and on a large scale. The lack of air defenses has left Ukrainian frontline troops extremely vulnerable. Russian aircraft are now dropping thousands of bombs on them, which is a new development in this war because Russia didn't have air superiority, but they are slowly gaining it as we speak. Also, Ukraine doesn't have enough artillery, which means Russian tanks and armored vehicles are advancing with fewer losses than before, which is a situation we haven't seen since early 2022. Russian forces are slowly but surely making gains, having captured over 360 square kilometers since the start of this year, and that is an area the size of Detroit. If we don't act quickly, Russian advances will only speed up, leading to significant territorial gains by 2024 and 2025, and possibly even a Russian victory. So what are our options here? Well, we can resume providing military aid quickly to help Ukraine stabilize their front lines, or we can do nothing and watch as Russia potentially defeats Ukraine and moves towards NATO territories from the Black Sea to central Poland. There's really no third option here. There is this cowardice that is permeating the US that Russia will hurt us if we help. And I just have to say, can we grow a pair already? They could have hurt us when Reagan was in charge, and he basically told them to stick their nukes where the sun don't shine. Even so, the risk of a Russian attack against NATO would actually dramatically increase if we were to allow Ukraine to fall. The Russians respond to weakness. They take advantage of it. And so our weakness could become an advantage for Russia in places like the Baltic states, which could become very difficult, almost impossible to defend if they were able to reposition their forces to that area away from Ukraine. The long-term risks and consequences of allowing Russian advancement are far greater than the short-term costs of supporting Ukraine now. A Russian victory in Ukraine would be disastrous for NATO's defense and its image. Conversely, if Ukraine can at least maintain their current positions, it would make any Russian attempts to advance in places like Poland or the Baltic states much more difficult. They would have to split their forces, which is extraordinarily risky. And those of you that say, oh, Russia wouldn't invade those areas, they're watching the United States' response. They're watching the elections, and they seem to truly think that they may be able to have a play against places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, countries that they're betting that potentially in the future, the United States would not come to the aid of despite them being in NATO. On the other hand, if Ukraine's military is successful, it would be the largest and strongest in Europe. It would outmatch the European NATO countries' forces. They are positioned along borders with Russia and Belarus, and Ukrainian forces would serve as a bulwark to deter and fend off future Russian aggression. Initially, yes, Ukraine would be dependent on equipment assistance, but they would gradually shift towards financial aid and loans from various European and Asian countries. And they would eventually buy and maintain its own military equipment. Ukraine's defense strategy is intertwined with the survival and security of NATO, regardless of the fact that they are not a member state. Should Ukraine enter a conflict anywhere in the world, Russia would have to account for that, because Ukraine would likely enter the conflict on the side of NATO, even if Ukraine isn't a part of the NATO alliance. This would significantly alter Russia's military strategies against NATO having such a powerful foe on their border. Conversely, if Russia were to defeat Ukraine, NATO would confront severe challenges in defending those northeastern countries because Russia could just rotate its forces to those areas, specifically the Baltic nations, as they've said they would do. Despite a likely Ukrainian resistance and possibly widespread insurgency, Russia would likely manage to maintain a strong conventional military presence in Ukraine. They've done it before since 2014. Such a scenario could enable Russia to conscript large numbers of Ukrainians and utilize Ukraine's emerging defense industry, boosting Russia's military and economic power dramatically. In this very grim scenario, NATO could face substantial Russian forces along its border stretching from the Black Sea to the Arctic, and this expansion of the Russian military threat would extend to the southern borders of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, regions that haven't seen any kind of threat from Russia since the Soviet era. This situation would strain NATO resources, pulling forces to the southeast of Europe and reducing the availability of reinforcements for the Baltic states. Facing a victorious and emboldened Russian military, NATO troops, many of whom lack experience in modern mechanized warfare, would find themselves in a pretty dangerous situation facing down the Russians. The frustrating thing here is I believe the right flank of the Republican Party knows everything I just said, and at best they don't care. At worst, they're doing this to help Putin, and possibly somewhere in the middle they're just wanting to use Ukraine to hurt Joe Biden. Or perhaps they prefer some strange alliance with Russia because they see it as manly and godly, some sort of 1950s version of the US. We saw Tucker Carlson's fawning over the Russian system. This is in contrast to a Europe they potentially see as effeminate and hedonistic. I'm not really sure, but whatever the reason is for their animosity towards supporting Ukraine, it is complete bullshit.